The war room of the Keltheran flagship hummed with quiet activity. Commander Tavares stood before the massive display screen, his four eyes scanning the tactical data with practiced efficiency. Behind him, dozens of officers monitored their stations, tracking the movements of the largest invasion force the hegemony had assembled in decades. For 3 years, the Keltheran had watched humanity expand into the outer colonies with growing concern. At first, they had dismissed Earth as another primitive species playing at galactic politics. That dismissal had cost them dearly. The humans fought like nothing the galaxy had seen before. They didn't surrender when the odds turned against them. They didn't retreat when logic demanded it. They simply kept fighting, adapting, and winning battles they had no right to win. Tavares had studied the reports obsessively. Human soldiers were relentless. They formed bonds with their fellow warriors that made them fight harder when their comrades fell. They used tactics that seemed insane until they worked. They turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. The Keltheran had tested them in small skirmishes, probing attacks, and limited engagements. Every time, the humans had bloodied their noses and sent them running. But Tavares had learned from those encounters. He had compiled data, identified patterns, and understood their methods. Human soldiers were predictable in their unpredictability. They favored aggressive counterattacks. They relied heavily on their technology. They coordinated beautifully at the squad and platoon level. Knowing this, Tavares had planned accordingly. The target was Nouveau Sol, a thriving colony world that served as humanity's primary supply hub in the Outer Rim. 40,000 civilians lived there, supporting the infrastructure that fed Earth's expansion. The military garrison was modest by galactic standards, only 200 Marines tasked with defending the entire planet. Intelligence suggested the humans considered it a safe rear area, not a frontline position. Tavares intended to shatter that assumption. His fleet consisted of 15 capital ships and 300 support vessels. His ground force numbered 60,000 elite Keltheran warriors, each one trained and equipped to the highest standards. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Overwhelming force applied with surprise and speed. The humans would have no time to call for reinforcements, no opportunity to mount their famous desperate defenses. They would be crushed before they knew what hit them. "Sir, we are 6 hours from the jump point," his tactical officer reported. Tavares nodded slowly. Victory was within reach. The destruction of Nouveau Sol would cripple human expansion for years, perhaps decades. It would send a clear message to Earth. The Outer Rim belonged to the hegemony, and no amount of human stubbornness would change that. What Tavares didn't know was that human intelligence had been tracking hegemony communications for months. What he couldn't understand was that the humans had different types of soldiers, and some of them operated by completely different rules. Deep beneath the Korean peninsula on Earth, a secure facility hummed with controlled urgency. The building appeared unremarkable from the outside, just another government complex among thousands. But below ground, in rooms shielded from every known form of surveillance, the most dangerous warriors humanity had ever produced prepared for deployment. Colonel Deho sat in the briefing room, his weathered face impassive as he absorbed the intelligence report. At 52, he had served in special operations for 3 decades. His hair had gone iron gray, and his eyes held the quiet confidence of a man who had survived situations that killed most others. Around him sat 11 more operators, each one a specialist in skills that regular soldiers never trained for. Lieutenant Ji-won was reviewing medical supplies, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated wounded soldiers in conditions that would have made a hospital surgeon weep. She was 31, small and quick, with a reputation for extracting wounded teammates from situations everyone else had written off as suicide missions. 17 times she had done the impossible. 17 times she had brought her people home. Sergeant Minho lounged in his chair with deceptive casualness, but his mind was already calculating blast radii and timing sequences. At 28, he could build an explosive device from almost anything. He had once demolished an enemy stronghold using fertilizer, kitchen timers, and components from a children's toy. The enemy had never figured out how he had gotten past their security. Corporal Hana was field stripping her rifle with mechanical precision, her movements as smooth as breathing. She was the team sniper, and her record spoke for itself. Confirmed kills at distances the enemy considered completely safe. She didn't talk much, but when she took a shot, someone died. Specialist Kyung sat hunched over a portable computer terminal, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she tested infiltration protocols. At 24, she was the youngest member of the team and possibly the most dangerous. She could hack into alien computer systems faster than their own operators could lock her out. She had once taken control of an enemy communications network and convinced an entire battalion to surrender by sending fake orders from their own command. The rest of the team represented similar expertise: close-quarters combat specialists, infiltration experts, intelligence analysts who could speak a dozen alien languages fluently. They were the sharp end of humanity's spear, the soldiers who deployed when regular military forces weren't enough. "Listen up," Daiho said, his voice cutting through the quiet conversations. The room fell silent instantly. "We have 72 hours before the hegemony hits Nouveau. So, the colony has 40,000 civilians and a standard marine garrison of 200. Intelligence indicates the enemy is bringing 60,000 warriors and enough firepower to level the primary settlement." The operators absorbed this information without visible reaction. Long odds were nothing new to them. "How many teams are they deploying, sir?" Ji-won asked quietly. Daiho met her eyes. "Ours." The silence that followed was profound. 12 operators against 60,000 enemies. It should have been impossible. The mathematics alone suggested they would be overwhelmed in minutes. Specialist Kyung broke the tension with a grin. Finally, a fair fight. Nervous laughter rippled through the room, but it was the laughter of people who had faced death before and developed their own ways of coping with it. These weren't regular soldiers who would hold a line and trade fire with the enemy. These were ghosts who would slip behind enemy lines, sow chaos, and multiply their effectiveness through cunning rather than firepower. Daiho pulled up a holographic map of Nouveau Sol. "We insert via stealth drop in individual pods. Scatter pattern across the primary continent. The enemy will arrive 18 hours after we land. Our mission is simple: make their numerical advantage meaningless. Disrupt their command structure, destroy their logistics, and feed intelligence to the marine garrison so they can hit the enemy where it hurts." The briefing continued for another hour, covering details of equipment, communications protocols, and contingency plans. But the core of the mission remained unchanged. 12 humans would face an army and convince that army they had made a terrible mistake. As the team dispersed to gather their gear, Minho caught up with Daiho in the corridor. "Sir, do you think they understand what they're walking into?" Daiho considered the question. The Keltheran had studied human soldiers. They had analyzed tactics, equipment, and doctrine. They thought they understood how humans fought. "No," he said finally. "They think they're fighting soldiers like they've seen before. They have no idea what special forces can do." He smiled grimly. "They're about to get an education." The stealth corvette would launch in 6 hours. 12 operators would drop into hell and change the course of a battle through sheer audacity and skill. The Keltheran would learn that defeating human soldiers was one thing. Surviving human operators was something else entirely. The darkness of space swallowed the stealth corvette as it approached Nouveau Sol. The ship designated Ghost Wind was a masterpiece of human engineering, designed for one purpose: getting special operations teams into places they had no business being. Its hull absorbed sensor sweeps instead of reflecting them. Its engines ran cold, barely warm enough to register against the background radiation of space. To enemy scanners, it was nothing more than cosmic debris drifting through the void. Inside the cramped troop bay, 12 operators sat in their deployment pods. The pods themselves were works of art, covered in ablative materials that would burn away during atmospheric entry, disguising the human cargo as meteor fragments. Each pod was barely large enough for one person and their equipment. For the next 6 hours, the operators would remain in induced hibernation. Their bodies cooled to reduce their metabolic needs and minimize their heat signature. Colonel Deho felt the familiar sensation of the sedatives entering his system. He had done this 37 times in his career. It never got easier, but the discomfort was irrelevant. The mission was everything. As consciousness faded, his last thought was of the Keltheran commander who thought he understood human warfare. That arrogance would cost him dearly. The pods launched in sequence, scattered across different approach vectors to prevent the enemy from detecting a pattern. They fell toward Nouveau Sol like raindrops, each one taking a slightly different path through the atmosphere. The ablative coating burned away in brilliant streaks that anyone watching might have mistaken for a minor meteor shower. Corporal Hana's pod landed in the northern highlands, a rugged terrain of rocks and sparse vegetation. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, despite the crash padding, but she was moving within seconds. Her hands found the pod's emergency release, and the shell split open like a flower. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of alien vegetation and ozone. She pulled herself free and immediately began the equipment check. Rifle, functional. Sidearm, functional. Ammunition, 60 rounds primary, 45 rounds secondary. Communications gear, active and encrypted. Medical supplies, intact. She buried the pod under rocks and debris within 5 minutes, leaving no trace of her arrival except some scorched earth that could have come from any meteorite. The position was perfect. From this elevation, she had clear sightlines to the valley where intelligence suggested the Keltheran would establish their primary landing zone. 3 kilometers of empty air between her and them. Most species would consider that range impossibly far for accurate shooting. Hana's rifle disagreed. 30 kilometers to the south, Sergeant Minho extracted himself from his own pod and surveyed his surroundings with professional appreciation. He had landed near the colony's main industrial sector, exactly as planned. Warehouses full of materials, factories with chemical supplies, transportation hubs with fuel reserves. To most people, it was just infrastructure. To Minho, it was a playground. He moved through the darkness like a shadow, his trained eyes identifying security cameras and avoiding their fields of view. The colony's security was designed to catch thieves and vandals, not military infiltrators. Within an hour, he had mapped out 6 different locations where he could create spectacular diversions when needed. Nothing was armed yet, nothing was dangerous, but all the pieces were in place. When the time came, he would turn this industrial sector into the enemy's worst nightmare. Specialist Kyung landed near the colony's communications center, a building that housed the civilian networks and the military's command infrastructure. She waited in the darkness for 15 minutes, watching the building and analyzing the security patterns. 2 guards at the front entrance. 1 patrol that circled the perimeter every 20 minutes. Standard electronic locks on the side entrance. Cameras covering the obvious approach routes. She bypassed all of it by going through the drainage system. The entrance was barely wide enough for her slim frame, and it stank of industrial waste. But it led directly to a maintenance corridor that security had forgotten to monitor. Within 30 minutes of landing, she was inside the building's server room, installing hardware that would give her complete access to the colony's digital infrastructure. The beauty of her work was that no one would notice. The devices she installed were smaller than coins, designed to blend in with existing equipment. They would intercept communications, copy data, and give her a window into every digital conversation on Nouveau. So, when the Keltheran arrived and tried to use the colony's own networks against the defenders, they would find those networks had already been compromised by someone much more skilled than they were. Across the continent, the other operators executed their own insertions with similar precision. Lieutenant Jiwan made contact with the Colonial Medical Center, quietly introducing herself to the staff and beginning preparations for the casualties that would inevitably come. The doctors and nurses were shocked to discover a Special Forces medic had appeared in their facility without anyone noticing. But Jiwan's credentials were genuine, and her expertise was immediately obvious. The Marine garrison became aware of the operator's presence 6 hours after insertion, when Colonel Daho walked into their command center and calmly introduced himself to Captain Soman, the ranking officer. Soman nearly had her guard shoot the intruder before she recognized the military insignia and authorization codes. "Special Operations Command," Daho said simply, handing her a data chip. "We're here to help." Soman stared at him, then at the chip, then back at him. "How many teams did they send?" "1. 12 operators total." The color drained from her face. "The Keltheran are bringing 60,000 warriors. We have 200 Marines." "You brought 12 people?" "We brought enough," Daho replied. His confidence was absolute, unshakable. "Your Marines are good soldiers, Captain. You'll hold the primary defensive positions and make the enemy pay for every meter they advance. My team will make sure they never get the chance to use their numbers effectively." He uploaded the contents of the data chip to her tactical display, and Soman watched in growing amazement as a comprehensive intelligence picture unfolded. Detailed information about the Keltheran fleet composition, predicted landing zones, enemy command structure, supply routes, communications protocols. Information that should have taken weeks to gather, all compiled and verified. "How did you get all this?" she asked. "That's what we do," Daho said. "In 18 hours, the enemy arrives. They'll expect to fight Marines. Instead, they're going to fight something they don't understand. Keep your people ready and watch for our signals. When we create openings, exploit them hard and fast." Soman had commanded Marines for 8 years. She had fought pirates, raiders, and aggressive wildlife. She had never seen anything like the quiet certainty in Daho's eyes. This man wasn't hoping for victory. He expected it. The Keltheran fleet arrived exactly on schedule, their massive ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel with the thunderous flash of displaced energy. Taurus stood on his bridge, watching the planet rotate below him, and felt satisfaction warm his chest. Everything was proceeding perfectly. "Deploy the ground forces," he ordered. "First wave to secure the primary landing zones. Second wave to establish command posts. Third wave to begin the advance on the civilian settlement." The invasion began with textbook precision. Thousands of dropships descended through the atmosphere, carrying the warriors who would crush human resistance and claim this world for the hegemony. Tavros watched the tactical display as his forces spread across the continent like a tide. And then the first dropship exploded. It wasn't a catastrophic detonation, just a small charge that disabled the engines and sent the ship spiraling into an uncontrolled crash. The warriors aboard survived, but they were scattered and disorganized. Tavros frowned. Mechanical failure? During an invasion? The timing was suspicious, but not impossible. Then 3 more dropships suffered similar fates. Then 6, then a dozen. Ships were crashing across multiple landing zones, creating chaos in what should have been a perfectly coordinated deployment. Tavros' frown deepened into a scowl. "What is happening?" he demanded. His technical officer stared at his console in confusion. "Sir, the ships report sabotage. Someone placed small explosive charges on their fuel lines before they launched. But that's impossible. We inspect every vessel before deployment." Minho, crouched in the shadows of a warehouse 3 kilometers away, smiled as he watched another dropship crash. He had spent the previous night sneaking aboard the Keltheran support vessels that had descended to refuel and rearm. The enemy's security had been designed to stop armies, not one man who knew exactly where to place a charge the size of a fingernail for maximum effect. The invasion was barely an hour old, and it was already going wrong in ways the Keltheran couldn't understand. Their warriors were scattered. Their deployment schedule was ruined. And somewhere in the darkness, 12 humans were just getting started. Tavros stared at the tactical display, trying to make sense of the chaos. This wasn't how invasions were supposed to work. The humans should be cowering behind their defenses, preparing for the inevitable assault. Instead, his own ships were betraying him. "Find out what's happening," he snarled at his officers. And find out now. But the third day of the invasion found Commander Tavris in a state of controlled fury. His overwhelming force of 60,000 warriors was scattered across Nouveau Sol like confused children, jumping at shadows and firing at ghosts. What should have been a simple conquest had turned into a nightmare of confusion and paranoia. The problems had started immediately after landing. First, the sabotaged dropships had scattered his forces and ruined the deployment schedule. Then the forward command post had simply vanished from communications. When scouts investigated, they found a crater where 300 warriors and their command staff should have been. The warriors themselves were discovered unconscious but unharmed, stripped of weapons and communications gear. Someone had spray-painted a message in perfect Keltheran script on a nearby wall. "You're not fighting soldiers anymore." After that, the attacks had become constant and impossible to predict. A sniper who struck from ranges the Keltheran had thought were completely safe. Supply depots exploding with no evidence of how the charges were planted. Communications jamming so sophisticated that their own equipment seemed to be actively working against them. Orders were intercepted, changed, and retransmitted. Entire battalions marched to positions that didn't need defending, chasing intelligence reports that turned out to be completely fabricated. Tavros had sent hunter-killer teams to find the humans responsible. Those teams had either returned empty-handed or didn't return at all. The ones who came back told stories that made no sense. Enemy soldiers who appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Attacks that came from directions that should have been impossible. Traps that used the Keltheran's own equipment against them. In the Northern Highlands, Corporal Hannah adjusted her scope and studied the Keltheran patrol moving through the valley below. 18 warriors moving in a standard patrol formation that her training had taught her to exploit. She calculated wind speed, air pressure, and the slight gravitational difference between Earth and Nouveau Sol. Her rifle was a precision instrument, and she knew its capabilities down to the millimeter. The patrol commander was easy to identify by the distinctive markings on his armor. Hannah's crosshairs settled on the communications pack he carried. She didn't want to kill him, just disable his ability to coordinate with his forces. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the rifle spoke with a sound like tearing canvas. 3 kilometers away, the communications pack exploded in a shower of sparks and shattered components. The patrol commander staggered but wasn't injured. His warriors immediately hit the ground, scanning for threats, but they were looking in the wrong places. No one considered that the shot had come from a distance their own snipers couldn't match. Hannah was already displacing, moving to a new position before the echo of her shot had faded. She would fire 3 more times from 3 different locations before the day ended, and the Keltheran would never get close to finding her. Each shot would disable communications equipment, destroy sensor gear, or eliminate key pieces of technology. She wasn't trying to kill everyone. She was trying to make them blind, deaf, and stupid. In the industrial sector, Sergeant Minho was creating art from chaos. The Keltherin had established a major supply depot in one of the colony's warehouses, filling it with ammunition, fuel, and spare parts for their vehicles. They had posted guards, installed sensors, and implemented security protocols that would have stopped any conventional attack. Minho had studied the building for 2 days, watching the guard rotations and analyzing the security systems. He didn't attack the depot directly because that's what they expected. Instead, he compromised the building's fire suppression system, rerouted some fuel lines, and planted tiny charges in locations the guards would never think to check. When he triggered the sequence, the results were spectacular. The fire suppression system activated without warning, flooding the depot with chemical foam. In the confusion, the rerouted fuel lines began leaking into the ventilation system. The small charges went off precisely, creating sparks that ignited the fuel-air mixture. The explosion wasn't large enough to destroy the building, but it was perfectly calibrated to make every piece of ammunition in the depot unreliable. The Keltherin would spend days sorting through their supplies, never quite sure which rounds were damaged and which were safe to use. Minho watched the chaos from a rooftop 4 blocks away, already planning his next target. The enemy had 6 more supply depots on this continent. He would hit them all, one by one, and never use the same method twice. Specialist Kyung sat in a maintenance closet in the colony's communication center, surrounded by portable computers and networking equipment. To anyone who might have found her, she would have looked like a technician doing routine maintenance. In reality, she was conducting the most sophisticated cyber warfare campaign the Keltherin had ever encountered. She had complete access to the colony's communication networks, which the enemy had tried to commandeer for their own use. What they didn't know was that every message they sent passed through systems she controlled. She could read their orders, intercept their intelligence reports, and inject false information into their data streams. A Keltherin battalion was currently marching toward a position she had designated as a critical human strongpoint in a fake intelligence report. In reality, the position was an empty field with nothing strategic about it. The battalion would waste 6 hours getting there, find nothing, and have to march back. By then, Kyung would have sent them 3 more fake reports, each one sending them to chase phantoms. Her favorite trick was sending contradictory orders to different units. She would tell one battalion to advance while ordering another to hold position at the same location. The resulting confusion and arguments between officers wasted hours and destroyed coordination. The Keltherin were starting to distrust their own command structure, wondering if their leaders had lost their minds. But the most devastating work was being done by Lieutenant Ji-won, and she wasn't firing a single shot. While her teammates harassed the enemy and sowed confusion, Ji-won was moving through the civilian population like a quiet storm, organizing them into a resistance network that made the Keltherin's lives miserable in countless small ways. She taught shopkeepers to give false directions to Keltherin patrols. She showed factory workers how to subtly sabotage equipment they were forced to repair. She organized children to act as lookouts, passing information about enemy movements through networks the invaders couldn't monitor. 40,000 civilians became 40,000 sets of eyes and ears, all feeding information to the human defenders. When the Keltherin tried to commandeer civilian vehicles, they found the fuel tanks contaminated with substances that wouldn't cause immediate failure but would destroy the engines after a few hours of use. When they tried to requisition food supplies, they discovered that someone had gotten there first and distributed everything to hidden storage locations. When they set up checkpoints, they found that the civilians had memorized alternate routes and could move through the city without ever being seen. Captain Soman and her 200 Marines were exploiting the chaos brilliantly. Colonel Deho's team fed them constant intelligence about isolated enemy units, weakened positions, and supply convoys that were vulnerable to attack. The Marines would strike hard and fast, hitting the enemy where they were weak, then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The Keltheran had numbers, but numbers meant nothing when you couldn't coordinate them effectively. They had firepower, but firepower was useless when you didn't know where to shoot. They had advanced technology, but that technology was being turned against them by someone who understood it better than they did. Tavares called an emergency council of his senior officers, his frustration boiling over into rage. "This is unacceptable," he shouted. "We have 60,000 warriors against 200 Marines and a handful of irregular fighters. We should have crushed them in the first day." His intelligence officer, Velmuth, spoke carefully. "Commander, I don't believe we're fighting irregular fighters. Our analysts have identified at least 12 distinct operational signatures. Different tactics, different specialties, but all coordinated with precision that suggests elite military training. We believe we're facing human special forces. I don't care what they are." Tavares slammed his fist on the table hard enough to make the other officers flinch. "They're 12 individuals. 12 against an army. How are they doing this?" Velmuth pulled up tactical data on the main display. "They're not fighting us directly, sir. They're making it impossible for us to use our numerical advantage. Every time we try to mass our forces for an assault, they hit our logistics. Every time we try to coordinate a complex operation, they compromise our communications. Every time we establish a defensive position, they either avoid it completely or find a weakness we didn't know existed." Another officer spoke up. "Sir, the troops are becoming demoralized. They're afraid to go on patrol. They don't trust our communications. They're seeing enemies everywhere, even when there's nothing there." Tavares stared at the tactical map. By the 7th day, the Keltheran invasion force had effectively stopped functioning as a military organization. Tavares still commanded 60,000 warriors, still had overwhelming firepower and numerical superiority, but none of it mattered. His army was paralyzed by fear and confusion, unable to execute even basic operations without dissolving into chaos. The psychological damage was devastating. Keltheran soldiers refused to patrol in groups smaller than 50, convinced that anything less was suicide. Officers spent more time searching for saboteurs within their own ranks than planning attacks on the enemy. Supply chains had broken down completely because no one trusted that their shipments hadn't been compromised. Communications were considered unreliable at best and actively hostile at worst. The warriors told stories that spread through the ranks like poison. Tales of human ghosts who appeared from nowhere, struck with impossible precision, and vanished before anyone could respond. Stories of comrades found unconscious with no memory of what had happened. Reports of traps so cleverly designed that the victims never saw them coming. The fear fed on itself, growing stronger with each retelling. Tavares had established his headquarters in the colony's central administrative tower, a fortress of metal and composite armor that should have been impregnable. He had stationed 5,000 warriors in and around the building, installed the most advanced security systems the hegemony possessed, and implemented protocols that would detect any conventional attack. But Colonel Deho didn't plan conventional attacks. The operation began at sunset. Sergeant Minho created a diversion on the eastern perimeter that was a masterpiece of misdirection. Explosions rippled through an abandoned industrial complex in a pattern that suggested a major assault. The blasts were perfectly timed, creating the illusion of a coordinated attack by at least a company of soldiers. Alarms screamed. Warriors rushed to defensive positions. Officers shouted orders into communication systems that Specialist Kyung was already manipulating. While 5,000 Keltheran warriors focused on the eastern perimeter, Kyung was inside the headquarters building's computer network, systematically taking control of every digital system. Security cameras showed exactly what she wanted them to show. Motion sensors reported clear corridors where operators were actually moving. Door locks opened and closed on her command. The building's own security infrastructure became her weapon. 3 kilometers north, Corporal Hana settled into position on a rooftop with clear sightlines to the headquarters tower. She wasn't there to shoot people. She was there to shoot equipment. Every sensor array that might detect the insertion team. Every communications relay that might call for help. Every piece of technology that could interfere with the operation. All of it was now within range of her rifle. Lafujin Jiwan was executing her own part of the plan, leading a team of armed civilians in a raid on the Keltheran prisoner holding facility. The enemy had captured 17 Marines during the week of fighting, and Jiwan intended to get them back. The raid was loud, violent, and designed to pull even more attention away from the headquarters. The civilians fought with the desperate courage of people defending their homes, and Jiwan's training made them far more effective than they had any right to be. All of this was coordinated to the second, every piece of the plan interlocking perfectly. The Keltheran were drowning in crises, unable to prioritize or respond effectively. And while they struggled to make sense of the chaos, 3 human operators were infiltrating the headquarters itself. Colonel Daeho, Specialist Bora, and Specialist Taiyang moved through ventilation systems that the Keltheran had considered too small for infiltration. The aliens were larger and bulkier than humans, and they had designed their security around their own physical limitations. It had never occurred to them that the enemy might be smaller and more flexible. The 3 operators wore matte black armor that absorbed light and sound. Their movements were perfectly silent, the result of thousands of hours of training. They carried weapons designed for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. Every piece of equipment had been selected for this specific mission, every contingency planned for. Bora was a close-quarters combat specialist whose record was terrifying even by Special Forces standards. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, but she moved with a fluid grace that made her seem like liquid given human form. In tight spaces where size and strength didn't matter, she was the most dangerous person alive. She had once fought her way out of an enemy prison using only improvised weapons and bare hands. 16 guards had tried to stop her. None of them succeeded. Taiyang was a weapons specialist whose marksmanship made even Hannah respect him. He carried a compact submachine gun that could fire specialty ammunition designed to disable rather than kill. In a hostage situation or a precision operation where collateral damage was unacceptable, Taiyang was the person you called. They bypassed security systems that were watching for armies, not 3 silent shadows. They slipped past sensors designed to detect Keltheran physiology, but not human. They navigated through the building using intelligence that Kyung had compiled over days of digital surveillance. Every guard position was known. Every patrol route was mapped. Every weakness in the security was identified and exploited. The command center was deep inside the building, protected by multiple layers of security and hundreds of warriors. The Keltheran had made it as secure as they knew how, and by their standards, it was impregnable. But their standards didn't account for human special forces. Daeho led his team through the final approach, moving through maintenance corridors that the enemy didn't bother to monitor, because nothing important could possibly reach them that way. They emerged in a storage room adjacent to the command center, separated from their target by a single reinforced wall and a squad of elite guards. Kyung killed the lights at exactly the planned moment. The entire headquarters went dark, emergency power taking several crucial seconds to activate. In that darkness, Taiyang fired 3 shots through the wall, guided by thermal imaging that showed him exactly where the guards were standing. The shots were non-lethal, but extremely painful. specialty rounds that caused instant incapacitation without permanent injury. Bora was through the wall before the guards hit the floor, moving like a ghost through the red emergency lighting. 2 more guards tried to respond, reaching for weapons they would never fire. Bora's training made the fight almost unfair. She struck at nerve clusters, pressure points, and anatomical weaknesses that her instructors had identified through careful study of Keltheran physiology. Both guards were unconscious in seconds. And then they were in the command center, and Commander Tavris was staring at 3 human figures in black armor, who had appeared in his supposedly impregnable fortress. Deho spoke calmly, his voice transmitted through a translator. "Commander Tavris, I believe you wanted to meet us." The remaining Keltheran warriors in the room reached for their weapons. Tayang was faster, his shots precise and controlled. Each round found its target, disabling without killing. The warriors dropped, clutching wounded limbs and howling in pain but very much alive. Bora moved through the chaos like a dancer, her close-quarters training turning the confined space into her advantage. The larger, stronger Keltheran couldn't bring their size to bear in the tight quarters. She struck at knees, elbows, and nerve clusters, each movement economical and devastating. Warriors who outweighed her by 50 kilograms crumpled like children. Through it all, Colonel Deho never moved. He simply stood there, weapon pointed at Tavris, absolutely calm in the middle of violence. When the last guard fell, the command center was silent except for the groans of wounded Keltheran. "You have 60 seconds to order your forces to stand down and evacuate this colony," Deho said. His voice was professional, emotionless, the voice of a man delivering information rather than making threats. "Or I demonstrate what happens when human special forces stop being polite." Tavris stared at the human before him. All his intelligence, all his planning, all his assumptions about human warfare had led to this moment. He commanded 60,000 warriors. The humans had sent 12. And somehow, impossibly, those 12 had reduced his invasion to chaos and penetrated his headquarters as if the walls were made of paper. "How?" he whispered, the question torn from him involuntarily. Deho tilted his head slightly. "You were fighting human soldiers before. Good soldiers. Brave soldiers. But soldiers who fight by rules, you understand." He paused, letting that sink in. "We don't have rules, Commander. We have objectives. And you're standing between us and ours." Tavris looked into those cold, professional eyes and saw something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't anger. This wasn't hatred. This was simple, calm certainty. The certainty of a predator that has cornered its prey and knows exactly how the encounter will end. The human wasn't bluffing. If Tavris refused, something terrible would happen. He couldn't articulate what exactly, but he knew it with absolute conviction. These 12 humans had turned his invasion into a nightmare. What would they do if he gave them permission to stop holding back? His hand trembled as he reached for the communications console. Pride warred with survival instinct, and survival won. He gave the order to withdraw. His voice, hatched the Keltheran retreat, was not dignified. 60,000 warriors abandoned their positions with such haste that they left behind equipment, supplies, and their pride. The withdrawal that should have been an organized military maneuver became something closer to a panicked flight. Ships launched the moment they were loaded, not waiting for stragglers. Officers abandoned their commands to ensure they weren't left behind. In 6 hours, the invasion force that had been meant to crush Nouveau Sol had vanished into faster-than-light travel, leaving nothing behind but debris and stories that would haunt them for years. On the surface, the colony erupted in celebration. 40,000 civilians poured into the streets, cheering and crying and embracing the Marines who had defended them. Captain Selman stood in the central plaza, watching her exhausted soldiers accept the gratitude of people they had protected, and felt a complex mixture of relief and awe. Her 200 Marines had fought brilliantly. They had held defensive positions, launched raids, and made the enemy pay for every small victory. But everyone knew the truth. They had survived because 12 Special Forces operators had turned the invasion into a disaster before it could properly begin. Colonel Dayhall and his team gathered at the Marine Command Center for the formal debriefing. They looked like they had been through hell. Their armor was scuffed and dirty. Dark circles shadowed their eyes from a week of minimal sleep and constant operations. But there was a quiet satisfaction in their bearing, the contentment of professionals who had executed a mission perfectly. "I still don't understand how you did it," Soman said, shaking her head in amazement. 12 of you against 60,000 of them. The mathematics alone says it should have been impossible. Lieutenant Jiwan accepted a cup of coffee from one of the Marines and wrapped her hands around it gratefully. Mathematics assumes both sides are using the same rulebook. We weren't. Sergeant Minho was already field stripping his equipment, cleaning weapons and checking gear with the automatic precision of long habit. They thought numbers mattered. They thought if they had enough soldiers, enough ships, enough firepower, they couldn't lose. He looked up, his expression serious. But wars aren't won by who has the most soldiers. They're won by who uses their soldiers best. Specialist Kyung was backing up data from her portable computers, saving intelligence that would be analyzed by specialists for months. They also assumed we would fight the way they fight. Stand in lines, trade shots, whoever has more people wins. We don't fight that way. We fight asymmetrically. We turn their strengths into weaknesses. Corporal Hannah was quiet as always, but she spoke when the conversation turned to tactics. They were predictable. Once we understood their doctrine, we could anticipate their moves and position ourselves accordingly. They never adapted. Every time we hit them, they responded exactly the way we expected. Soman listened to the operators dissect the week's operations with clinical precision. They spoke about manipulating enemy psychology, creating cascading failures in command and control, and multiplying their effectiveness through careful planning. It was warfare as she had never seen it practiced, and it was terrifying in its effectiveness. "What happens now?" she asked Colonel Deho. The colonel glanced at his team, then back to her. "Now we write reports that will make intelligence analysts very happy. We rest for a few days, and then we redeploy. Somewhere else, another crisis is brewing. Another situation where conventional forces aren't enough. Another mission that requires operators instead of soldiers. Will it always be like this? 12 people against impossible odds?" Deho considered the question. "Not always. Sometimes we get 15. He smiled slightly, the first real expression of humor she had seen from him. "We scale to the mission, Captain. Sometimes we need a full company of special forces. Sometimes we need a single operator. This mission required 12, so that's what they sent us." The formal debriefing lasted for hours, with Soman and her staff asking detailed questions about tactics, techniques, and procedures. The operators answered as much as security classifications allowed, sharing lessons learned while protecting methods that needed to remain secret. But the real story was spreading across the galaxy through different channels. Keltheran officers were filing reports that their superiors read with growing horror. Intelligence agencies were analyzing the collapse of the invasion and drawing uncomfortable conclusions. Military academies were beginning to study a new kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on numerical superiority or overwhelming firepower. The Keltheran hegemony filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Council about irregular warfare, tactics, and psychological manipulation. The human ambassador listened to their grievances with polite interest and declined to apologize. Everything the Special Forces operators had done was within the rules of warfare as humanity understood them. If the Keltheran didn't like those rules, perhaps they shouldn't have started a war. But the real change happened in the quiet conversations that occurred in military headquarters across 100 worlds. Alien strategists who had studied human soldiers and thought they understood human warfare were now forced to reconsider everything. If regular human soldiers were dangerous, what did it mean that humanity had an entire separate category of warrior who operated by different rules? The answer terrified them. On Nouveau Sol, the celebration continued for days. The civilians wanted to meet the operators who had saved them, to shake their hands and thank them personally. Colonel Deho politely declined most such requests. His team had done their jobs. The recognition wasn't important to them. But Lieutenant Jiwan made time to visit the medical center, checking on the wounded and talking with the staff she had worked alongside. Sergeant Minho helped repair some of the infrastructure damage his explosives had caused, working alongside colony engineers who were amazed at his technical knowledge. Corporal Hannah gave a marksmanship demonstration for the Marine sharpshooters, showing them techniques they had never imagined possible. Specialist Kyung ran a seminar on communication security that left the colony's IT staff simultaneously educated and terrified. A week after the withdrawal, the team gathered at their temporary barracks for final preparations before departure. Their equipment was cleaned, repaired, and repacked. Their reports were filed. Their wounds mostly minor, though Specialist Taiyang had taken a nasty cut during the headquarters raid, were healed. Think they learned their lesson? Specialist Bora asked, adjusting the straps on her pack. Deho shrugged. Some of them did. The smart ones will study what happened here and adapt their tactics. The stupid ones will convince themselves it was a fluke and try again. Good, Minho said cheerfully. Job security. The team shared quiet laughter, the dark humor of people who had faced death and survived. They knew better than to be arrogant, but they also knew their capabilities. They were the best at what they did, and what they did was win battles the conventional forces couldn't. The transport ship that would carry them back to Earth arrived on schedule. As the operators boarded, Captain Soman and her Marines formed an honor guard, saluting the 12 operators who had saved their colony. Deho returned to salute crisply, his team following suit. Good luck, Captain, Deho said. The Keltheran won't try this again, but someone else might. Keep your people sharp. We will, sir. And thank you. For everything? The transport lifted off into the clear sky, carrying the operators toward their next mission. On the ground, the civilians and Marines watched until the ship was out of sight, then slowly returned to the work of rebuilding and preparing for whatever came next. Across the galaxy, the story spread. Not the official reports or the diplomatic complaints, but the whispered stories that soldiers tell each other. Stories about human operators who appear from nowhere, fought like demons, and vanished like ghosts. Stories about 12 humans who had defeated an army through cunning, skill, and absolute refusal to accept that the odds mattered. The aliens had learned to respect human soldiers. Good, brave soldiers who would hold any line and assault any position if ordered to do so. But now they learned about a different kind of human warrior. Operators who didn't hold lines or assault positions. Operators who infiltrated behind enemy lines, sowed chaos, and broke armies without firing a shot unless absolutely necessary. In military academies on 100 worlds, new chapters were added to warfare textbooks. New courses were developed to study asymmetric warfare and special operations. New countermeasures were designed to defend against tactics that had destroyed the Keltheran invasion. But the human operators kept adapting, kept learning, kept evolving, because that's what they did. That's what made them special. On the transport ship, Colonel Daho sat in the quiet crew compartment and reviewed mission data on a tablet. His team was scattered through the ship, sleeping or checking equipment or simply staring out the windows at the stars. In 72 hours, they would be back on Earth. In 96 hours, they would receive their next mission briefing. Somewhere in the galaxy, another crisis was brewing. Another situation where conventional forces wouldn't be enough. Another mission that would require operators who understood that warfare wasn't about fair fights or Hano,